Beneath the shimmering surface where sunlight bends and dances, there exists a quiet world, alive with whispers and hidden messages. Shells scatter like ancient letters on the ocean floor, while shadows weave stories that only the keenest senses can unravel. What if the reef could speak, not in words, but in patterns, in shapes and movements understood by those who truly listen? This is a tale of discovery, of secrets etched in coral and shadows, and the delicate language that connects all who dwell between land and sea. Soft, calming voice, gentle ocean sounds fade in, distant waves rolling rhythmically. Imagine yourself standing at the edge of a vast coral reef, just as the sun begins to rise. The early morning light slips softly through the water, casting delicate shadows over the intricate patterns of shells and coral beneath your feet. The reef breathes quietly, a world of subtle motions, tiny fish darting through the shadows, sea urchins nestled among the rocks, and the slow, rhythmic pulse of the ocean swell. In this quiet, hidden realm, an ancient language is spoken, not with words, but with shapes, textures, and the steady pulse of the tides. You feel the coarse sand between your toes, scattered with fragments of shells worn smooth by centuries of waves. Each shell, each shadow cast by a swaying seaweed frond, tells a story of survival, adaptation, and the delicate balance between the ocean and the people who have lived alongside it for thousands of years. This is a story not often told, the story of how coastal communities once understood the secret language of the reef, how they read the patterns in shells and shadows to navigate, fish, and survive. It is a story of patience, observation, and resilience passed down quietly through generations. As the light grows stronger, revealing more of the reef's secrets, you begin to wonder, how did these ancient people interpret the subtle signs of the ocean? What knowledge did they hold that allowed them to thrive in such a complex and often unforgiving environment? You stand at the cusp of discovery, ready to listen to the whispers of shells and shadows, and the language the reef has spoken for centuries. Soft ocean sounds fade out. The world of coastal communities has long been intertwined with the reefs that fringe their shores. These reefs were more than just natural formations. They were vital ecosystems and living libraries of knowledge. For many ancient cultures, the reef was a source of food, shelter, and guidance, a place where survival depended on understanding the smallest details of the environment. Long before modern navigation tools, people living near reefs developed a deep, almost instinctual knowledge of ocean swells, tides, and the creatures that inhabited these waters. This knowledge was painstakingly gathered through daily observation and handed down through oral tradition. The language of the reef was subtle. It was written not in words, but in the shifting light on the coral, the patterns of shells scattered across the seabed, and the fleeting shadows cast by the interplay of water and sunlight. One critical aspect of this language involved shells. Coastal peoples recognized particular types of shells as indicators of certain environmental conditions. For example, the presence of specific mollusk shells might signal the start of a fishing season or the movement of tides. The texture and wear on shells could indicate changes in the water's temperature or the strength of the currents. Over time, this information became essential for planning daily activities: when to fish, when to collect shellfish, or when to avoid dangerous areas during storm seasons. Beyond shells, shadows played a significant role. The reef's uneven surface created complex shadows that shifted with the angle of the sun and the movement of the water. Skilled observers could read these shadows to discern the direction of the swell or the presence of predators like sharks lurking nearby. Shadows also helped in navigating the reef safely, guiding people around sharp coral outcrops or sudden drop-offs. The language of the reef extended into social and cultural practices as well. Shells were often used in rituals and adornments, symbolizing connection to the sea and its mysteries. The patterns of shells laid out on beaches or in underwater arrangements sometimes served as messages or markers, communicating information across families or communities. This deep connection between people and reef was not merely practical, but spiritual. Many coastal societies believed the reef was alive with spirits, and that respecting its language was a form of communication with these forces. This belief reinforced careful observation and sustainable interaction with the environment, ensuring the reef's health and the community's survival over generations. In the broader context of history, such knowledge often went unnoticed or undervalued by outsiders who prioritized more conspicuous achievements like wars or empires. Yet, the quiet persistence of reef languages and the survival skills they enabled represent a profound legacy. They remind us that history is also made up of the everyday decisions people make to live in harmony with their surroundings. One notable example comes from the island communities of the Pacific, where the reef was central to life. Anthropologists studying these societies found that navigators and fishers could predict weather changes and ocean conditions by closely watching the types of shells washing ashore and the behavior of reef shadows at different times of day. This expertise was essential for voyages and seasonal migrations. However, the understanding of reef languages was not static. It evolved as communities adapted to environmental changes, external influences, and shifts in social structures. The arrival of new tools or trade goods sometimes altered traditional practices, but the core knowledge of shells and shadows remained a cornerstone of coastal life. Today, much of this knowledge risks being lost. Modern technology and changing lifestyles have diminished the reliance on natural signs for survival. Yet, efforts to document and preserve these ancient practices highlight their ongoing importance, not only for cultural heritage, but also for modern conservation efforts. The reef's language offers insights into ecosystem health and sustainable living that remain relevant. As you contemplate the vast, intricate world beneath the waves, you might wonder, what secrets of survival, encoded in shells and shadows, have slipped through the cracks of recorded history? How might rediscovering this ancient language change our relationship with the ocean today? These questions linger like the ebbing tide, inviting you to delve deeper into the hidden history of reefs and the people who listened closely to their silent language. At first light, when the tide is at its gentlest, reef walkers used to begin their day barefoot on the shallow flats, their steps deliberate and practiced. The act of walking the reef was not casual. It was a skill honed over decades. You had to know exactly where your feet would sink too deep, where the coral was too brittle, and where the sea urchins made their silent, prickly homes. And you needed to know how to read the reef's changing language, spoken in fragments of shell, texture of sand, and patterns in fish movement. Even silence had meaning. If a part of the reef that normally hosted small fish was quiet, something had disturbed it. A shadow too wide or too still might mean a predator nearby, or something else, something out of place. This kind of knowledge could not be taught in a single lesson. It began in childhood, with small tasks like watching tidal pools or carrying a basket for shells. Older siblings or grandparents would murmur quiet comments. Notice how the sand shifts when that current passes, or feel the weight of this shell. It grew thicker because the season was harsher. These were lessons given in fragments, built slowly into an internal map. Over time, a child who had absorbed these observations could become someone others trusted to make decisions about food collection, fishing routes, or safe timing for reef crossings. Among these tasks, collecting shells held a specific importance. Shells were not only for ornament or currency, they were clues. Some communities noticed that certain shell types appeared only after storms, or that their color faded in tandem with changes in water salinity. In Tonga and Tuvalu, for instance, elders could tell whether the coral polyps were healthy by examining the shells of mollusks that fed on them. A bleached or brittle shell warned of reef stress, perhaps due to a warm current or disrupted spawning season. In a time before oceanographic tools, the shell was a diagnostic instrument, simple, overlooked, and astonishingly precise. The same held true for how shadows moved over water. In areas where the reef formed tall coral ridges, reef walkers learned how to predict underwater valleys and hidden crevices based on how the sunlight shifted as clouds passed overhead. In midday brightness, these shadows sharpened, allowing skilled fishers to drop their nets exactly where schooling fish might hide from heat. By contrast, on overcast days, when light diffused more evenly, shadows were softer and deceptive. Fishers on such days would rely more on texture than tone, feeling the resistance of the reef underfoot, or using split bamboo rods to tap gently along the floor and listen for the hollow resonance of deeper pockets. It might seem like a small thing, tapping a stick, feeling for texture, but these tiny acts were survival. Misreading the reef could mean injury, hunger, or even death. Coral cuts could turn septic quickly. A misstep near a venomous creature could disable a person for days or permanently. So people learned caution. They learned to trust the quiet knowledge passed through generations. You might think, in such quiet lives, that nothing ever changed. But changes came slowly, and when they did, left subtle but deep marks. For example, as trade routes expanded and more outsiders arrived in island communities, foreign tools began to shift the pace of daily life. Metal knives made shell collection easier, and fishing nets grew stronger and broader. These improvements brought efficiency, but they also began to disrupt the delicate timing of reef harvesting. Where before, a family might wait 3 tidal cycles to collect shells again from a known spot, confident the ecosystem had recovered. Now others began harvesting too soon, or too much. The language of the reef began to sound jumbled. Shells appeared broken. Shadow patterns changed, not because the reef changed, but because its rhythm was disturbed. Stories from Kiribati describe how, within a single generation, elders noted that the reef did not speak clearly anymore. They meant this literally. The indicators they had relied on no longer aligned with results. A shell that once meant clear water now appeared before storms. Shadows that had signaled fish now fell across empty rock. Some elders blamed this on disrespect. They believed that people had stopped listening properly. Others blamed the tools, the haste, the noise. Either way, the reef was no longer a perfect map. It was a landscape filled with static, where signals conflicted and uncertainty grew. Amid this confusion, some people continued their quiet work of interpreting and preserving. In coastal Papua New Guinea, an oral tradition persisted into the 20th century in which families assigned particular shell types to specific memory chants. These chants were sung during reef walks, reinforcing the connection between shell appearances and environmental cues. A chant might describe the shell's markings, its weight, and its location, but also embed the season, the direction of the wind, or a family event. This made the knowledge relational, not just observational. It became embedded in human memory through emotion, association, and rhythm. Even the act of placing shells carried meaning. Along certain Pacific coastlines, people arranged shells in shallow water to create pathways for fish, or as subtle markers for communal boundaries. Outsiders often dismissed these as decorative or ritualistic, but within the community, their meanings were precise. This type of shell, placed in that formation, meant, "Do not gather here until after the rains," or "Tread softly, young coral is growing beneath." By the late 19th century, as colonial systems began to impose different forms of land use and ownership, these silent agreements were often ignored or overwritten. But the knowledge didn't vanish. It shifted into quiet acts of resistance. People still sang the chants to their children, still noticed the shadows and the shells, even as their use became more symbolic than practical. In many places, the language of the reef began to be preserved, not because it was needed daily, but because it held identity. It reminded people of their lineage, their place in the world, their deep connection to the tides, and the earth's slow breath. What's striking is how much of this knowledge is still recoverable. Marine biologists working today with indigenous communities often find that reef language, while fractured, still exists in fragments. A grandmother who remembers the right shell for clean water. A fisherman who knows which shadows mean parrotfish hiding beneath. Or a weaver who still uses shell dust for binding certain ceremonial fibers. These fragments, when collected carefully, form not just a cultural archive, but a living guide for sustainable reef interaction. And as sea levels rise and reefs face unprecedented pressure, this knowledge becomes newly relevant. It is not a nostalgic curiosity, it is data. Centuries of pattern recognition encoded in quiet actions and soft-spoken songs. To understand these traditions is not only to honor their origins, it is to reimagine how we interact with ecosystems today, not as masters, but as attentive participants. Still, one wonders, how many of these subtle understandings, how many shell signs, how many shadow patterns, have disappeared entirely? How many meanings are lost, not with the death of a person, but with the simple silence that follows when no one asks? It was in the quiet hours before midday that the reef truly revealed its slower rhythms. After the early movements of shell collectors and reef walkers had softened into silence, the reef was allowed to breathe undisturbed. It was in this stillness that elders sat, often on smooth, flat rocks or beneath the shade of leaning coconut palms, holding shells in their hands not for use, but for contemplation. Turning them slowly, they studied ridges, openings, slight discolorations. Some spoke aloud to no one in particular, not to instruct, but to recall. Each shell had lived a life, had clung to coral, endured currents, and hidden from predators. Its wear told a story of how the sea had behaved in the days, weeks, or years before it had washed ashore. A smooth underside might suggest calm waters and steady tides. A chipped lip or pitted exterior could hint at storm-tossed journeys, collisions with rock, or acidic changes in the water. In some coastal villages, this slow examination of shells formed part of daily life, in the same way others might check the sky for clouds or the scent of the wind. It was routine, and yet it required a practiced mind, one that had seen enough seasons to know that no single shell was evidence, but a gathering of shells together might form a pattern. This practice became especially important during years of unpredictability, when the ocean offered conflicting signs. During El Niño years, when rainfall patterns shifted and ocean temperatures fluctuated, shell reading became an act of triangulation. Elders would seek out certain rare shell types, those that only appeared when water salinity dropped or when currents reversed. Their appearance could help explain why fishing had failed or why shoreline vegetation browned too early. And though the knowledge was ancient, its application was urgent. In other regions, such as parts of the Solomon Islands, shells were woven into more formal decision-making. Before planting coastal gardens or relocating temporary homes, a group of community elders would conduct a kind of silent census, walking the high tide line, noting which shells had arrived and how they were clustered. Shells from deeper water, especially if found in pairs, might suggest unusual current activity, while particular gastropods might indicate the return of seasonal fish that followed their presence. This wasn't superstition. It was historical observation applied practically. The reef spoke softly, but for those who had grown up listening, its voice was steady. While these practices endured, they were not impervious to interruption. One of the greatest disruptions came not from natural disaster, but from the quiet spread of concrete and steel. As modern harbors were built and coastlines reshaped to accommodate trade and shipping, many reef environments were dredged or buried. Places once rich with shell-bearing life were transformed into ports, resorts, or seawalls. The reef, silenced by construction and runoff, stopped sending its signals. Without living coral, the shell population declined. Without shells, there were fewer stories to read. Younger generations, raised near these altered shorelines, had only fragmented knowledge of what the reef had once said. This loss was not immediate. It echoed slowly, like a forgotten melody. Older villagers remembered shell names their grandchildren had never heard. Traditional songs referencing shadow play on coral heads began to fade from common gatherings. Some remained only in fragments, phrases buried inside lullabies or metaphors used in jokes. A reef's vocabulary shrinks when its listeners leave. But even as this shrinkage occurred, a kind of quiet resistance formed, often led by women. In many communities, women remained the primary shell collectors, especially for ornamental or ritual use. As men turned to wage labor in towns, women's daily engagement with the shore continued. They became keepers of shell knowledge, not always consciously, but through habit. In the atolls of Micronesia, for instance, older women could still name 20 or 30 types of shells based solely on their sound when dropped into a woven basket. Their hearing had attuned not just to shape or color, but to the specific dullness or sharpness of the shell's clatter. This sensitivity was not only poetic, it was practical. Some shells had medicinal value, ground into powder or heated and applied to wounds. Others were used to determine whether a new section of reef was safe to explore, based on how recently the species had last been seen. Stories also circulated about particular shell types being used as a quiet form of warning. If a certain shell appeared on a household's threshold, placed there not naturally arrived, it could signal everything from a dispute over reef access to a death in the family. These meanings were rarely explained openly. They were known by context, timing, and the silent agreement of those who participated. The reef language was not always spoken. It was enacted, lived, felt. Then there were the shadows. At certain hours of the day, when the sun leaned low but had not yet set, the reef cast elongated shadows across the water's surface. These shadows, observed from the shoreline or from a raised platform, were studied like moving maps. Their shapes changed, not just with the sun's angle, but with the clarity of the water, the depth of coral growth, and the motion of fish schools. In places like coastal Vanuatu, elders trained young observers to sketch these shadow shapes in sand using their fingers. They would draw outlines, then erase them as the shadows moved, training the eye to notice the reef's tempo. This practice was quiet, meditative, and essential. Knowing how shadows stretched at different tide levels helped people predict how long they could safely fish, or how fast a storm might be approaching from the far sea. Sometimes, the shadows played tricks, bent oddly by surface tension or cloud reflections. Learning which distortions to trust and which to dismiss was part of the deeper education of reef watching. It wasn't enough to see, one had to interpret. This was perhaps the most sophisticated part of the reef's language, its ambiguities. Not every shell meant the same thing in every context. Not every shadow could be read in isolation. The true experts were those who understood when to withhold judgment, to wait for more signs, or to confer quietly with others before acting. Modern scientists who study these practices often express amazement at the complexity of this knowledge. Marine ethnographers have found that in some cases, the traditional shell-based indicators of spawning periods align closely with what modern satellite-based ocean temperature models suggest. Yet this knowledge was carried without charts or thermometers, only by hand, by eye, and by memory. There's a word in several Polynesian languages that means something like to hold in the skin. It describes a kind of embodied memory, knowledge you don't recite but simply do. The language of the reef, in many ways, lived in the skin. In the soles of the feet that knew when coral was brittle. In the fingertips that knew when a shell was heavy with residue. In the shoulders that adjusted instinctively to a rising swell. It is knowledge held in motion, in repetition, in quiet. Still, even as some of this knowledge persists, there is always the question, how much more could have been known if we had listened sooner or more carefully? If we had recognized the reef not just as a site of beauty or resource, but as a speaking partner in history? What does it mean that we have grown quiet while the reef has, in its own way, tried to keep speaking? At low tide, when the reef lay bare like the spine of the sea itself, some families made their way out to the furthest edge, where the coral met open water. It was here, on this narrow threshold between familiarity and the unknown, that one could best see the reef's relationship with time. To the untrained eye, it was just a long ridge of stone and shell, bristling with seaweed, glistening in the sun. But for those who had learned its features through patient study, each notch and crevice held meaning. This ledge was not merely a natural feature, it was a record, a living manuscript written in the slow handwriting of tide and current. People did not just walk across it, they read it. Some elders explained the reef's edge as a place where the past and the future met. Certain patterns of broken coral, especially when found consistently in the same season, might signal that a major swell had passed far out at sea, soon to make its presence felt on shore. Others pointed to the way that sand shifted in hollows, indicating long-term changes in underwater flow. Children, instructed to observe but not interfere, would sit with their elders and quietly trace their fingers through tide-formed grooves, practicing the art of distinguishing patterns shaped by wind from those made by deep ocean currents. In some communities, this knowledge formed the basis for long-term planning. When families considered building new canoe shelters or planting new coconut groves near the waterline, they first observed the reef edge over a cycle of moons. They watched how water lapped against its farthest arms during high tide, noting whether unusual wave action began to touch rocks that had been dry in previous years. Such changes did not lead to alarm, but they did lead to adjustment. The reef, like any language, changed over time. What mattered was learning to interpret the new vocabulary, to understand the emerging syntax of coral and current. The far edge of the reef was also a place of caution. While the inner flats were well known, even to children, the outer reaches could shift quickly and without warning. Swells could rise abruptly, cutting off return paths. Sea creatures that rarely ventured inland were more common here. This sharpened the senses. Shadows, so useful in calmer waters, became less reliable, fractured by the chop of waves and the bright glare of open sunlight. So observers relied more on subtle shifts in temperature underfoot, the feel of water pressure, or the sound of distant wave impact against rock. Many reef walkers carried with them a short stick, often carved from driftwood, not as a weapon, but as a tool for testing depth and firmness. A tap against the coral floor could tell much about its structure. Hollow tones might suggest a hidden cavern or the presence of burrowing creatures. A dull thud might mean sediment was building, or that the reef beneath had hardened and aged. With time, reef walkers learned to recognize these acoustic fingerprints. They could move confidently even in unfamiliar parts of the reef, guided by the quiet feedback their tools gave them with every step. While these practices were practical, they were also steeped in cultural meaning. The reef's edge was often associated with ancestral spirits or guardians. In oral histories from coastal Papua New Guinea, certain coral outcrops at the reef's boundary were described as listening stones, places where one could sit in silence and hear what the sea had to say. These tales were not understood as metaphorical. The belief was that if you sat long enough, with patience and humility, the sea would show you something, a new path for fishing, a safe cove you had missed, or a warning of coming change. Whether or not one believes in spirits, the practice itself fostered a kind of listening that modern life often erodes. It demanded stillness. It required that a person do nothing except observe, feel, and remember. For those who practiced it, this form of attention was not mystical, but methodical. It was based on noticing the repetition of small details over long spans of time. How the sea spray hit the rocks, the rhythm of crab movement, the growth rate of barnacles. In its way, it was a science of slowness. In the 20th century, with the arrival of formal education systems, many of these practices began to be viewed as obsolete. Children were taught to measure and categorize with rulers and textbooks. While this brought many benefits, it also slowly eroded the status of reef walkers and shell readers. Their knowledge, often unrecorded and tied to place, seemed unscientific to outsiders. And yet, When climate researchers began to ask why certain communities were better prepared for typhoons or storm surges, they often found the answer lay in local knowledge passed down through shell signs and reef observations. For example, in the outer islands of Fiji, elders used the behavior of a particular mollusk species to predict rising sea levels over short intervals. When these mollusks began to cluster unusually high on the rocks, above the normal splash zone, it indicated prolonged changes in tidal behavior. This observation, made without instruments, led to small but crucial decisions: raising storehouses by a few inches, planting farther inland, reinforcing canoes differently. These adaptations were rarely documented formally, but they accumulated over time into resilience. Elsewhere, shadow watchers played a quiet but vital role. In Samoa, certain elders observed the movement of deep reef shadows during full moons, correlating their stretch and angle with the timing of fish spawning. These observations informed fishing bans or celebrations. When colonial laws disrupted traditional calendars, many of these patterns were forgotten or dismissed, but not all. In remote coves and villages, individuals still held on to their understanding of how reef shadows could be used to protect, not just harvest, marine life. Sometimes the knowledge even resisted colonization actively. Oral accounts from 19th century missionaries describe frustration at how locals refused to accept European tidal charts. The charts were correct in abstract terms, but they failed to capture the nuances of each reef's unique shape, depth, and angle to the sun. Locals continued to trust their shell signs and shadow readings. It wasn't ignorance, it was precision that could not be replicated on paper. Even today, some of these distinctions endure. In coastal areas of Indonesia, divers trained by their elders can still identify dozens of reef zones by feel alone, guided by subtle differences in coral texture, water current, and shadow angle. They know, for instance, that a certain kind of long, thin shadow in the afternoon means deep channels underfoot and potentially dangerous currents. This is not something a depth gauge or satellite image can always confirm. It is local, lived, and immediate. The language of the reef, then, is not lost. It is quiet, submerged beneath layers of noise and speed and modern extraction. But it waits, patient as the reef itself, for someone to listen. It does not shout. It never has. It speaks in small textures, repeated patterns, and seasonal rhythms. If you stood now at the edge of such a reef, feet on wet coral, wind brushing your ears, could you learn to hear it? Could you remember a language you never learned? One passed down, not through books, but through the patient hands of those who bent to study shadows. In the quiet space between daily chores and evening fires, stories once drifted across island courtyards like sea breezes. These were not just tales of adventure or ancestors. They were detailed narratives of shells and reefs, shadows and currents. In these stories, a young girl might follow a broken shell trail to find a new tide pool teeming with life, or a fisher might notice a shadow stretching too long across the reef and turn back, avoiding a sudden squall. These were not metaphors. They were instruction manuals embedded in memory, coded in rhythm, softened by repetition. Through them, generations learned not only how to survive, but how to listen. Often these stories were told slowly over many nights. A single tale could be stretched across the lunar cycle, told in chapters that mirrored the reef's own tidal rhythm. Some families remembered particular narratives being told only during the lowest tides of the year, when the reef exposed its secrets most fully. The story would begin when the tide pulled furthest back, and by the time the sea returned to its full height, the lesson would be complete. The reef, in that way, helped pace the telling. One such tale, recalled in fragments across parts of Kiribati and Tuvalu, told of a boy who misread the reef's signals. He saw a cluster of cowrie shells, gleaming pale against the dark rock, and assumed it meant a time of plenty. But he ignored the absence of certain seagrasses and the unusual dullness of the morning shadows. He fished too soon, too deep, and disturbed a delicate spawning ground. For days the sea withdrew its gifts. His family waited, hungry. The story ended not in punishment, but in humility. The boy, learning to watch the reef again from the beginning, listening more carefully, noticing what he had once dismissed. These stories were more than cautionary tales. They were libraries. They taught reef reading in ways that bound memory to emotion, decision to consequence. Long before formal instruction, children were made fluent in a visual and tactile language. A shell was not just a shell, it was a word, part of a sentence formed in partnership with the sea. The physical reef mirrored these stories. Along certain island chains, reefs bore names, just like villages. A particular outcrop might be known as the Whispering Stone or the Mother's Elbow, names which reflected the way water moved around them or the shell types that gathered there. When storms reshaped the reef, the names sometimes changed, or were passed to new locations that had taken on the same characteristics. In this way, reef geography remained fluid but memorable, like an oral map always being rewritten with the tide. Some communities took the mapping further. On the island of Yap, for instance, navigators once created stick charts, delicate frameworks made from palm ribs and shells, arranged to represent swells, island locations, and currents. While these charts are now often displayed in museums, their original use was deeply practical. The arrangement of shells on a frame was not arbitrary. It corresponded to specific reef formations and swell interactions, passed on from elder to apprentice through demonstration and discussion. A chart might include a shell symbolizing a deep reef passage that, when seen from a canoe, would cast a certain kind of shadow on the water's surface. It was both tool and memory prompt, designed to be interpreted with prior knowledge. Yet not all reef knowledge was shared freely. Some shell interpretations were closely guarded within families, passed only to certain members when they reached a particular age. Others were gendered, known only to women or men, depending on their traditional responsibilities. There were shells whose uses were never spoken aloud, their meanings revealed only in times of illness or spiritual need. These silent segments of the reef's language were not secrets for secrecy's sake, but protections, held close to ensure they would not be misused or misunderstood by those unprepared. As coastal societies encountered missionaries, traders, and colonial governments, many of these layered meanings were stripped away. Shells became curiosities for foreign collectors. Shadows, too complex for quick explanation, were left unspoken in reports. Some community members, encouraged to adopt new ways, stopped passing on their stories, believing they had little place in a future shaped by maps, textbooks, and clocks. Still, even as oral storytelling diminished in formal settings, it slipped into the unnoticed corners of life. A lullaby might retain a phrase about shadowfish or coral that hums. A grandmother, sorting shells by the hearth, might hum the melody of an old reef story without naming it. These fragments endured in tone, in gesture, in the way a finger traced the spiral of a shell or a hand paused mid-air to imitate a tide's rise. Reef language survived in the body long after words faded. In recent years, researchers and community leaders have begun to gather these fragments with new urgency, not to fossilize them, but to understand their continuity. Young people have returned to their grandparents with audio recorders and sketchbooks, asking questions that had not been asked in decades. And in these quiet, intergenerational exchanges, something has stirred. Elders, often quiet in public life, have found their knowledge sought again. They point to tide marks with their walking sticks. They hold up shells and ask, "Do you remember what this one says?" This resurgence is not uniform, nor is it simple. Some knowledge has vanished beyond recovery. Shells once common have become rare due to reef bleaching. Shorelines have shifted, and with them the rhythms that once anchored observation. But adaptation has always been part of reef culture. The very ability to read shells and shadows was born of change, of subtle shifts noticed and absorbed over generations. That capacity for listening to the sea, to each other, remains. And as environmental pressures mount, that listening becomes more than cultural. It becomes essential. In places where satellite data still lags, where formal systems overlook small islands or underestimate their risks, local knowledge offers immediate clarity. When shadows fall differently, when shells arrive in unfamiliar clusters, People who have kept their attention sharp respond. They move livestock inland. They repair storm walls before the warnings come. They harvest cautiously, leaving more than they take. It is slow knowledge, but it moves quickly when needed. This raises an uncomfortable question for the modern world. What does it mean that we sidelined these ways of knowing for so long? What losses might we have avoided had we listened earlier? Not just to data, but to people who had always read the reef as a text, page by page, day by day. If you were to sit now with an elder on a reef ledge, your feet dangling above tidal pools, and ask them to teach you, would you be willing to learn slowly, over seasons, with humility? Could you accept that the reef speaks not in answers, but in patterns, in rhythms, in signs that take a lifetime to understand? Some afternoons, when the tide lingered low and the horizon shimmered with stillness, groups would wade out not for food or tools, but for repair. The reef, despite its silent strength, was not unchanging. Small shifts in coral formation, breakage after storm surges, or the movement of sandbanks often called for subtle, almost invisible maintenance. This was not construction in the modern sense. It was reef tending, done without claim or announcement. And it was built upon generations of knowing where things used to be. In island communities where such practices thrived, families were informally assigned stretches of reef, not for ownership, but for care. These zones were watched closely. A missing coral bridge between two outcroppings might cause sand to shift, uprooting seagrass where juvenile fish hid. A collapsed overhang could alter water flow, changing the shadow play vital to spawning grounds. When something changed, those who noticed did not record it in ledgers or send word to officials. They gathered quietly, sometimes only 2 or 3 people, and they began to put things back. They did not bring tools forged in fire. Instead, they brought pieces of coral harvested from natural breakage, placed by hand with tidal knowledge. They used shell fragments to guide water gently across new growth areas. Sometimes they added nothing, only removed debris or cleared algae-choked passageways. They watched how sunlight filtered through water onto the newly tended areas. If shadows settled too harshly or created glare that startled fish, the placement would be adjusted days later. These small interventions were unspoken agreements between the community and the sea. The reef gave, so they gave back. Some called this reef whispering. Others simply called it watching. It was never done in haste. If a young person offered to help but moved too quickly, planting coral with force, stepping too loudly, it was gently suggested they return the next day to try again. Precision mattered. Even the direction from which one approached the reef could influence how creatures reacted, whether new growth held or whether sediment scattered. These same reef keepers often knew the names of particular shells that only appeared during reef stress. One such shell, known across several Polynesian dialects as something akin to the Watcher, emerged during periods of unusual heat. Its presence near certain sea fans indicated thermal stress long before coral bleaching became visually obvious. When the Watcher shell appeared, families responded by limiting reef harvests, canceling certain fishing days, or gathering for shared meals instead of dispersing across collection zones. They adjusted behavior not out of fear, but respect, heeding the reef's quiet warning. As colonial systems formalized coastal governance, these practices were rarely documented. Reef whisperers were sometimes dismissed as superstitious or inefficient. Attempts were made to standardize reef care through imported methods: cement placement, reef blasting for navigation, large-scale fish farming. These efforts often ignored the micro-patterns locals had followed for generations. In many cases, artificial reef interventions failed because they lacked the patience or precision that had defined traditional reef care. Coral would not take root. Fish would not return. The reef did not respond to haste. Despite these disruptions, informal repair continued in the margins. A grandmother walked alone at dusk, placing broken fan coral back where she'd seen growth the season before. A father taught his children how to collect fragments only after strong current events, never during calm tides. A group of elders gathered without ceremony to clear a passage blocked by invasive algae. The work was done slowly, reverently, with the understanding that the reef remembered. Every gesture mattered. Even now, in parts of Melanesia and Micronesia, these quiet maintenance traditions remain intact. Marine scientists who've partnered with local communities often remark on the reef's resilience where such practices continue. It is not just that the coral thrives, it is that the people's relationship with the reef strengthens both ways. The reef speaks through its changes, and people respond not with extraction, but with adjustment, care, and observance. Children raised near these living reefs sometimes inherit this attentiveness without knowing it. A child might grow up believing that everyone notices when a particular sea snail no longer clings to a certain rock, or when the green hue of seaweed dulls under certain moons. Only later, when they move away or return after time apart, do they realize what they knew was rare. This realization often rekindles the thread, drawing them back into quiet participation. A new generation of reef tenders begins, not with declarations, but with a return to watching. Modern tools, too, are now finding ways to support these practices. In some places, waterproof notebooks are being used to draw reef diagrams modeled after shadow studies. Mobile phones capture daily photos from fixed reef points, building a slow-motion archive of change. But these tools are most effective when they work alongside, not instead of, the ancient methods. The reef's language is too nuanced for single measurements. It speaks in sequences, in layers, in relationships among species, rocks, tides, and people. The patience required for this kind of reef stewardship is perhaps its most uncelebrated feature. There is no sudden result, no instant fix. One may tend a patch of reef for 3 seasons before life returns as it once did. And even then, there is no guarantee it will stay. Tending is not the same as controlling. It is more like keeping a promise, one made long ago between land and sea, body and place. Some have likened this process to breath. The reef exhales during low tide, reveals its bones, lets itself be seen. And in those hours, people move gently across its surface, listening, adjusting, tending. Then the reef inhales again, disappearing beneath the waterline, carrying with it the traces of their care. It is a rhythm that asks for humility, a practice that insists on remembering. So if you stood now at the edge of that breathing reef, could you still the urgency in your hands long enough to tend something without seeing immediate reward? Could you learn to repair not what you broke, but what broke slowly, invisibly, over time? The return of the tide in late afternoon often marked a shift in attention, not away from the reef, but inward, toward the memory of what had been observed. This was the time when reef walkers and gatherers, both young and old, would sit along woven mats or by tide-worn stones, drying their feet, brushing sand from their legs, and sorting through what they had collected. Shells, coral pieces, dried seaweed, and the occasional oddity, feathers, driftwood, polished stones, were spread out slowly. But this was no mere cataloging. It was a memory ritual. Each object had been gathered deliberately, and now it asked to be remembered in detail. For older generations, this moment was not optional. The act of sorting was itself part of reef learning. Young hands were encouraged to touch, smell, and weigh each shell. Elders would point out tiny features, spiral turns too tight, surfaces too smooth, ridges too wide. These details hinted at currents, seasons, the presence or absence of predators. If a shell seemed heavier than expected, it might be a sign of mineral buildup in the reef's base layer. If one seemed faded too early in the year, perhaps algae had bloomed too fast. Every shell was a question posed by the reef, and the answers were rarely final. In many places, these sorting sessions evolved into something else entirely. Song. Not performance, not ceremony, but shared humming and chants that named the shells, or recalled the conditions under which similar ones had appeared. Some melodies were centuries old, surviving solely because they were tied to reef observation. The rhythm helped fix knowledge into memory. A child who couldn't yet explain the meaning of a shell's color could still remember the verse that connected it to a storm 2 decades past. This binding of sensory memory to sound created a kind of reef literacy not easily erased. It's worth noting that not all objects collected from the reef were natural. In more recent times, and especially in the last century, reef walkers began returning with strange additions: metal fragments, glass beads, tangled nets. These arrivals were not accidents, they were signs of distant events. A broken bottle smoothed by sand might suggest a ship passing too close. A tangle of fishing line buried in coral could mean overharvesting from outside communities. These new objects had no names in the old chants, no verses to explain them. So new words began to emerge, soft, cautious ones, often whispered more than sung. Some communities began weaving these foreign materials into reef stories, not to normalize them, but to mark the change. In parts of the Marshall Islands, older women began stringing found plastics alongside traditional shell necklaces, calling them echo pieces. They were not worn proudly, but kept in homes as reminders of shifts in current, in behavior, in the nature of listening itself. They did not belong to the reef's language, but they had been forced into its grammar. The reef, always patient, had included them. Now the people had to decide whether they would ignore, resist, or reinterpret. Some chose reinterpretation. They began tracking these new arrivals as carefully as the shells. Notes were made about where and when certain plastics appeared. Observations were shared across island networks. In this way, the reef language expanded, not in celebration of what was lost, but in acknowledgement of the present. The reef had changed, its speech had gained a new dialect, and those who had spent their lives listening were the first to detect it. Even so, these changes were not without grief. Many elders, during evening reflections, spoke of quiet mourning, not dramatic, but persistent. They missed certain shells that no longer arrived, or crabs that had vanished from crevices. They noticed the shadows had changed, not in how they stretched, but in what they concealed. The reef's transparency had dulled. It still spoke, but its clarity had dimmed. Still they returned. The next day, the next tide, they were there, walking slowly, pausing often, fingers grazing rock. Because listening to the reef was not dependent on its perfection. It was about commitment, relationship, reciprocity. You watched even when it hurt. You remembered even when the remembering carried weight. In this way, the practice of reef watching became a kind of archive. Not a library of books, but of gestures. A person leaning to scoop a shell with the edge of their foot. A hand raised to shield eyes from sun glint while studying a distant shadow. The careful rubbing of sand between fingers to check moisture and grit. These movements, repeated thousands of times across lifetimes, were forms of writing. The reef remembered them, and so did the people. This physical archive grew even more significant during times of silence. After cyclones, tsunamis, or prolonged periods of drought, the reef often grew quiet. Shells disappeared. Fish hid. The tide brought nothing but foam. During these times, communities relied not on the reef itself, but on memory. They sang the shell songs not to describe what they saw, but to recall what they once saw. These were acts of preservation, not of data, but of relationship. There is a word used in some Polynesian traditions that describes this process loosely as carrying the reef inside. It means remembering so thoroughly that you can walk the reef with your eyes closed and still know where you are. That you can sit miles inland during a storm and still feel the pattern of tide and shell beneath your skin. Elders who reached this state were not mystics. They were simply patient, attentive, grateful. This capacity to carry the reef inside is perhaps the final test of the listener. When the reef grows silent, or changes, or breaks, can you still hear what it once said? Can you carry the tone of its voice long enough to teach it to someone else? At dusk, when the water took on the color of hammered bronze and the reef returned to shadow, people no longer walked its edges. They watched it from a respectful distance. The day's listening was over, and the reef, like any tired elder, needed rest. But even in rest, it spoke. The reflection of sky on surface water told of air temperature, and the scattered ripple of retreating crabs hinted at whether tomorrow's low tide would arrive early. Elders sat along the upper beach, wrapped in quiet, and let the reef speak without prompting. This twilight hour became a daily ritual, not just for observation, but for remembering what had been seen. Children, exhausted from play, lay with their heads in the laps of mothers who brushed sand from their hair while murmuring half-finished shell stories. These weren't lessons in the formal sense. There was no expectation of memorization or repetition. They were moments of absorption, where words mingled with wind and the scent of salt. A child might not remember a sentence, but they would recall the tone in which it was spoken, the way a shell was held up to the fading light, or how silence followed certain names. In some communities, this time was referred to in a word that loosely meant the softening. Not just the softening of light, but of the mind. It was believed that one remembered best when not trying, when listening without urgency. So the reef's language, like a lullaby, entered through the side door of attention. People learned to observe without gripping too tightly. Knowledge gathered like condensation, accumulating slowly and almost invisibly, until one day it dripped into certainty. Among those who remained devoted to this rhythm were the shadow readers. These were often older individuals, men and women who had trained themselves to read the flickering movements of twilight shadows across the reef's surface. Unlike the hard shadows of midday, dusk shadows were diffuse, mutable. They required not only visual skill, but patience. A moving shadow might not be an animal, but a shifting water current layered over coral. Or it might be the edge of a cloud, high above, magnified by water's lens. Learning to distinguish one from the other took years. One of the most revered skills was the ability to predict weather by dusk reflection. A certain pale streak in the water's mirrored sky might hint at high humidity inland. A subtle delay in the cooling of reef pools could signal a restless wind arriving in the night. These indicators were not mystical, they were observational, but they were interpreted through a vocabulary built over a lifetime. An outsider might see only beauty. The reef watcher saw message after message, woven across the liquid skin of the sea. This twilight watch also served another, quieter function. It allowed for unspoken comparison. If someone had noticed something strange during the day, a shell out of season, a discoloration in the coral, they could sit near another watcher and wait. A sideways glance, a quiet intake of breath, or a shared look toward a particular outcrop was often enough to confirm what was unspoken. In this way, knowledge was shared laterally, without hierarchy or proclamation. The reef did not need interpreters who spoke the loudest. It favored those who observed, remembered, and waited. Sometimes, people brought out old tools during this hour, not to use them, but to hold them. Shell knives dulled by years of use, coral scrapers wrapped in coconut fiber, nets with mended holes. These objects held memory. They had worked the reef, listened to it through action, and now they sat in hands that no longer needed to move quickly. Just holding such tools seemed to sharpen memory, reminding the fingers of movements they had made 1,000 times before. The tools themselves were not magical, but they carried echoes. Holding them was like pressing a shell to the ear, not to hear the ocean, but to hear time. Over the years, as technology reached farther into remote archipelagos, the reef twilight practice dimmed. Electric lights replaced the need to rely on sky reflection. Radio forecasts outpaced local weather signs. The shadows no longer spoke because they no longer needed to. And yet for many, there remained a feeling that something had been lost. Not just information, but a way of relating. A way of understanding the sea, not through screens, but through skin. In recent generations, a quiet revival began. Not in museums or universities, but on beaches at dusk. Young people, curious about the stories half heard in childhood, returned to sit beside their elders. They didn't always know what to ask, so they watched. At first, they simply copied the stillness. bent their heads at the same angle, let their eyes follow the same choral line. They learned not through instruction, but by resonance. One grandmother, when asked how she taught her granddaughter to read reef shadows, answered only, "She sat beside me." That was the lesson, to sit beside, to watch the watchers, to absorb not just data, but disposition. There are modern reef studies that now echo these traditional practices. Satellite-based reef imaging has confirmed what dusk watchers have long known, that coral color and shadow interaction are some of the earliest indicators of environmental stress. But where satellites offer snapshots, the human eye offers sequence. A person watching from the same place every day can detect not only change, but pace. The speed of change, the emotional weight of it, cannot be seen from space. It must be felt. As light faded, the reef transitioned into what some elders called the silent part of speech, the part of the reef's language that said nothing, but still communicated. This silence wasn't emptiness, it was invitation. It asked, "What will you remember from today? What did you miss? What will you return to tomorrow?" In some villages, children were taught to whisper their observations aloud before sleep, not to be corrected, but to form the habit of reflection. One might say, "I saw 3 fan shells where yesterday there were none," or "The shadows stretched over the deep pool differently." These whispers became part of the reef's language too, not as facts but as echoes. The reef listened back. Through this practice, memory became collective. One person might forget, but the community remembered. And so, over time, the reef's language grew into something larger than its parts. A network of eyes, hands, thoughts, and rhythms that moved with the tides but belonged to no single individual. It was not a heritage possessed. It was a relationship renewed each day. Imagine now, if you can, sitting in that fading light. The heat of the day has lifted. The sea breeze moves softly over your skin. Before you, the reef is half submerged, half revealed. The shadows shift with slow elegance. There is no one speaking. There is only looking. And in that looking, 1,000 memories pass between people and place. The reef, still breathing, waits to be heard again. In the deeper hours of the night, when the sky became a dark shell scattered with stars and the wind settled into a whisper, the reef was no longer a place to walk or watch. It became a place to remember. It was in this time, when even the smallest shore creatures withdrew and the ocean stilled into long, steady sighs, that the reef entered the realm of dreams. Not in the way of fantasy, but as presence, quiet, anchoring, unshifting. Families slept in raised huts or beneath simple canopies, lulled by the rhythm of waves touching reef stone, pulling away, touching again. That sound carried everything. It was breath, boundary, and lullaby all at once. Those born near the reef often described its nighttime presence not as silence, but as density. Even in sleep, one felt it, like a shape behind closed eyelids. The reef remained active, even when unseen. The tide kept moving, reshaping, testing. Fish drifted into hidden cavities, bioluminescent algae pulsed softly in tide pools, and in the farthest reach of coral formations, nocturnal feeders glided between rocks, unobserved. But the people did not need to see it to know it was alive. That trust in what the reef was doing while they slept, was a form of knowledge in itself. In many communities, dreams were considered an extension of reef listening. A child who dreamed of a shifting shell pattern, or an elder who saw the reef darkened in sleep, might share such visions the next morning, not to predict, but to reflect. These dreams were not considered prophecy. They were a different kind of memory, one that emerged from deep familiarity with the reef's sounds, patterns, and presence. Just as someone who knows a path well might dream of walking it differently, those attuned to the reef often carried its language into their sleeping mind.